Hello, everybody in Humanities 105, popping in once again for our video lecture this week. We ran through news media last week, and of course, I hope you all have caught up with doing the reading, watching last week's video, the discussion boards, and the reading test for this past week. Um, I did want to mention, I think I'm going to play around a little bit this week with making those meeting times on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on Zoom something that's a little bit more than just plain office hours. If you do have office hours sort of questions, you can do that. But I'm also thinking, at this point, it's 3 weeks since we've seen each other in the classroom. And it would be fun, perhaps, to have one of those bull sessions where we kind of toss around whatever's happening in the news, in the media, that sort of thing. So if you want to do that Tuesday or Thursday afternoon at 4, I will be on Zoom. I'd be happy to hear from you. We can talk about just what's going on in the world, try to make as much sense of it as we can, just like we did at the start of class when we were meeting in the classroom up until a couple of weeks ago. Now, that being said, I do want to get to the topic for this week, which is movies. This is I'm teaching two other full courses about the movies this semester. Clearly, I could go on forever and ever and ever when it comes to this topic. I won't. I'll try not to. I'll try not to. That might be the safer way to say this. But what we want to do is take a look at movies, going to the movies, watching movies in the same way that we have our other forms of mass media, business, technology, culture, so on and so forth. So let's start on the technology side of things. It's worth noting that the word movies itself is, well, actually, I should mention I'm going to use three terms that are sort of interchangeable: movies, film, and cinema. Those all mean the same thing. Those are just three words for movies, just different terminology. Regardless, movies are a form of media based upon an older form of media, and in fact, based upon fascinating bits of just how we perceive the world that go all the way back to some of our most ancient times. This stuff you can look up if you're interested in these terms. You can find this stuff online. Movies are essentially a modern industrial update of an ancient optic phenomenon called a camera obscura, which is this incredible thing where if you take a darkened space, imagine this room I'm in right here, if it had even less light in it, completely darkened, but there was just like a little pinhole sized hole in the opposite wall, then the wall right next to me here would have an exact image of what's outside, just a brick wall, but that brick wall would then be projected, so to speak, on the wall that's right next to me here. This is something that humans seemingly have known about for a long time. There seems to be some ancient Greek stories that reference what we now call a camera obscura, and it's something that artists have used as a tool for centuries now. If you've ever heard of the famous painting Girl with a Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer, that was created with the aid of a camera obscura. The artist would set up one of these devices in his studios so that when he was painting, he had basically a perfect he basically pre-composed the image in the studio, and then the painting themselves were just transferring that light in the darkened space into oil on canvas. Now that still takes a lot of skill, but it's something that, with the help of the tool, you get nearly photorealistic paintings, and this is like 1600s Netherlands we're talking about here. So this is a powerful technology. And that's something that gets harnessed in the industrial age. That's when a bunch of inventors, the first one was in France, a guy named Guy Nepis or something like that. He invents what becomes the prototype for cameras, which are smaller devices, usually about the size of a shoebox in that era, maybe a little bigger, a little smaller eventually, that are essentially take the camera obscure idea, shrink it down, and capture the light through chemical reactions. You'd get materials and layer chemicals on top of them. Initially, it was a lot of glass and metal. Eventually, it transfers to paper. And when you let the light through the lens in the front of the camera, it would activate the chemicals on your base material, and that would become the printed photograph that you could then turn around and hang on a wall. but you get the idea. This is something that's invented back in the 1820s, and it becomes a very common popular mass medium by the latter half of the 1800s. Photography is incredibly common by the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s. Fascinatingly, I've loved sharing this ever since I learned it. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist who was born a slave in Maryland in the 18 teens and lived to become one, maybe the most famous man in America in his day. He was possibly the most photographed person in 1800s America because he thought that if people could see his face, see the scars on his body, see the soul in his eyes, that they would know African Americans, black slaves, were humans, and they were not just animals, which is what white slave owners depicted them as. And I find that really, really fascinating. If you go look up a Frederick Douglass uh, portrait like that one, you can get, I think, a strong sense of the power that photography it can have. It can take the real world and turn it into something tangible and reproducible. Now, movies come along in the late 1800s, elaborating upon this technology by creating a new device that can capture pictures so rapidly and then project them so rapidly that it tricks our eye and our brain into perceiving motion and light as if it were reality. The earliest inventions along this line are probably back in the 1880s. Thomas Edison is one of the people involved in working all on this, though I never want to give Edison credit for stuff for complicated reasons. But the people who usually get the main credit are a pair of French inventors, Louis and Auguste Lumiere, who invent a device they called a cinematography, and then use it to record small clips around Paris. I'll upload a couple of examples of these onto links on Brightspace, and they show them to a paying audience at the Grand Cafe in Paris back in 1895, 1896. The world's first movie is a 50-second clip called Train Pulling into a Station, and that's literally all it is, just a train pulling into a suburban Paris train station. Uh, that is the origin of Black Panther, as odd as that sounds. Now, obviously, those early film clips, and like I said, I'll post those on YouTube. You can watch ones that were made by the Lumieres, by Edison, including a couple here in Chicago. It's fascinating to see the Chicago ones. They're essentially the image they capture of Chicago are probably familiar places: State and Madison and downtown, Clark and Wrightwood and Lincoln Park. But they are so altered by the past 120 years that they're unrecognizable. It's a ghost city, despite the fact that it is tangibly Chicago. I love that shit. But early movies like that have a lot of technical limitations that you would not expect if movie theaters were open right now. Notably, early films were all black and white. There was no color until much later. They were all completely silent. There was no sound, no dialogue until decades later. They were all quite short. Those short little films I'm talking about, none of them are longer than a minute. All of these developments come later, and I'll give you a quick sort of timeline of them really quickly here. So the first couple of years of cinema are just little documentary films, you might call them. The Lumieres called them actualities, and the Edison Company, their products became known as the cinema of attraction. So you would just watch people dancing, stuff like that, just pure visual attraction. There was no story until about 1890. 899, something like that. And then people start telling more and more elaborate stories. If you want to learn more about this, you can take a history of cinema course. But by the time you get to about 1914, 1915, 20 years after the train pulling into a station screening in Paris, you get the release of a movie called Birth of a Nation, directed by a fellow named D.W. Griffith. This is one of the most important movies ever made, and it is also a movie that I will never, ever, ever, ever screen for students. It is a 3 hour long epic about the Ku Klux Klan that makes the Klan into the good guys, saving white women from freed black men after the end of the Civil War. Yeah. 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 It's incredibly important, not because of its content, but because it was a feature length film. That means it's not just a short running, maybe 15 to 30 minutes. Instead, Birth of a Nation is like 3+ hours long. It was like an opera going to the musical. It was a full length entertainment. People had not done that with movies before. So that is a real game changer, creating what our standards for modern motion picture content. Now, there's other technological leaps. Synchronized sound, when you have the audio and sound either recorded at the same time or synced up to perfection. That's invented at the end of the 1920s. And again, racism plays a role. The first movie with synchronized sound to become a big hit is called The Jazz Singer. It's about a Jewish cantor who also wants to be a Broadway star, but he makes his big breakthrough on Broadway while singing black songs in blackface makeup. What is wrong with us? I mean, I know what's wrong with us. It's shit like that. Happily, racism plays less of an obscenely obvious role in later developments in cinema history. There is the advent of colorization, where they're able to take the black and white negative and turn it into a full color image. The earliest and most popular of these is called Technicolor, which actually looks more bright, more vivid, more saturated than real life itself. That was part of the spectacle. You go to see something like The Wizard of Oz, for example. That early section of the film is not. Well, I know it is black and white, but then they start adding in little sepia tones, and then they add full color when they get to Oz. But that color is brighter and richer than anything you could ever imagine. It's absolutely spectacular. Um, you get other technological little tinkering that happens over the succeeding decades, moving from a square shape to a rectangular shape, the widescreen format in the 1950s. You get the release, the creation of home video in the 1970s and 1980s, VHS being one of the major ones in that time period. But it's not really until the last 30 years that you see the next really big leap in movies' technological history. About 1990, I would say, you see the beginning of the usage of CGI, computer generated imagery, in motion pictures. Initially, this is mostly used for special effects. If you go back and watch a movie like Terminator 2, Judgment Day, or Jurassic Park, there's a lot of scenes that use computer generated characters, sometimes humans, sometimes dinosaurs, you get the idea, and has them do things that would have been impossible with puppets or other previous forms of special effects. This is obviously something that is extremely common, to the point that, these days, I should say, to the point that if you look at something like Star Wars or the Avengers, it's an honest question how much of it is real and how much of it is CGI. Uh, Hard to say. It's a little hard to say, but every big blockbuster these days is loaded with computer generated special effects. The other big jump that's happened recently is the rise of digital filmmaking. What that means is movie cameras these days no longer have to have a physical film stock, a roll of celluloid, which pulls 24 takes 24 photographs per second just by rolling the film through the lens that quickly. And that, by the way, is still the projection speed, 24 frames per second. Every single second of a movie is 24 still photographs blasting past you so quickly that it looks like continuous motion. That's been mostly replaced by the technology that I'm speaking to you with today, digital cameras, which sense light not through a chemical process, but through electronic sensors, and then convert them into compressed video files. That's how most blockbusters, most movies these days are really, if they're not filmed on digital cameras, they're definitely worked on through digital processing. The editing process, sound mixing, all of that is done through computers rather than through the old fashioned, literally, like the old way of editing movies was just like airplane model glue and scissors. Nobody does that anymore. They have Final Cut Pro. So all of those are big technological leaps that make a movie released in 2020 very different than a movie released in 1920 for obvious reasons. But I think that is a good overview of just the general technological evolution of movies. And I did want to mention really quickly, kind of closing thought here, if you want to see a movie, going to the movie theater is still, I wouldn't say the most common, but it is the initial form of release for movies, that they're closed right now. But there's also DVD and Blu-ray. There's streaming. There's downloading through digital webs through web services like the Apple Store, the Google Store, stuff like that. There's watching it on TV. All of these provide movies for us, and it's worth noting, for the first half of movies' existence up until about 1950, the only way of seeing a movie was going to the theater. And if you didn't see it when it was in the theater, you were probably never going to see that movie. That has an interesting effect on how people watched movies, and how many people watch movies. And we'll talk about that in the other video. All right, talk to you then.